Last Sam's Cage by David A. Poulsen, Chapter 8, page 82. He was wrong. The first thing he saw when he woke up wasn't a twig or a leaf. It was a duck, quite small and all brown and curious. Eddie remembered from biology that the duller-colored birds were females. Her bill was practically against his face, and he could see her feet moving in the water beneath her. They looked at each other for a while. Then the duck gave a little quack and swam off. After that, he saw a lot of her. In fact, it became a kind of ritual every morning when he opened his eyes. The duck was there like a feathery alarm clock. He was positive it was the same duck because she never missed a day. He had no way of knowing how long she was there before he opened his eyes, but each time she was in almost the same spot, sometimes looking at him, other times ignoring him completely, and eventually swimming off to do whatever ducks did with their day. Eddie liked to read. He couldn't remember a time when he didn't like reading. He could remember his dad reading out loud when he was little. When he got older, they switched roles and Eddie did the reading. If his dad ever got tired of all those Hildegard stories Eddie was into back then, he never let on. Eddie read Big Red out loud so many times he could still remember a lot of it, even after all this time. He'd always liked Saturdays at home because Steve usually left the house early and Eddie could stay in bed with a book until his mother decided it was time he got up and had breakfast. Sometimes he'd knock off a whole book in the morning, especially something easy like The Hardy Boys or some other mystery. He didn't read The Hardy Boys or Kierkegaard anymore, but he still liked mysteries. It was funny, but when he was reading, he didn't mind being still. Maybe that whole learning style thing didn't apply to reading. It was kind of embarrassing being a reader. None of the guys he hung out with would be caught dead reading a book, and he had to put up with lots of comments. Sometimes the comments weren't all that funny, probably because they weren't meant to be. Just now, Jack London was the #1 author on Eddie's list. He'd written a book report on the Call of the Wild for Miss Shackleton and had got an A on it. And now he was reading White Fang. He'd always wanted a dog of his own, but his dad had said the yard in Long Prairie was too small for a dog, and they'd always rented after they moved to the city. Rental places never allowed dogs. Maybe that was the best part of living at the zoo. It was like having a few hundred animals for pets, and he didn't have to feed them. Reading in the condo, that's what he decided to call the place, was one of those good news, bad news deals. Eddie soon learned that he could lie there as long as he wanted, and even in the driving rain, there had been a fair amount already that spring. Not a drop of water found its way in. That was good. The bad part was that even on a bright sunny days, the condo remained quite dark, and once the sun went down, reading time was over. He needed a flashlight. In fact, more than food or money, the thing that drove him most towards attempting a B&E was the need for a light to read by. Actually, there were a few things he needed, like a Walkman. He wished he could listen to music once in a while. That was something else he hoped to grab. And of course, a little money wouldn't hurt either, since he couldn't read after dark. Nights were the worst times. Boredom was the part of his new life that he hated the most. He had thought of a few times about going to see Charlie and maybe Linda in Chinatown. But something kept him from going. Fear? Eddie had never been a coward, but the longer he was free, the more he wanted to stay that way. And his luck with cops had never been great, so why push it? Charlie and Linda would have to wait. Nighttime was also when he did most of his thinking. That was bad because because thinking about things at night made them seem worse than when he thought about them during the day. Sometimes he worried about what would happen to him. He tried not to spend a lot of time on that, but it was impossible not to. Spring was about to roll into summer, but even summer would eventually end. He knew that if he didn't have a real home or job by then, he'd have to become a lot more active on the crime scene. And he wasn't sure that was what he wanted. It was more than the dread of getting caught again. Although there was nothing he hated more than the thought of being back in the CYOC. But this was different. This was a different feeling. Eddie had started to wonder if maybe there wasn't something else, something better. One thing was for sure, he didn't want to end up like Stink Pigglers of the world, or even the Ratsies. That was something else he thought about when darkness surrounded the stream and the condo. There was one very badass creep out there who wasn't about to forget what Eddie had done. And if they ever met again, even if it was 5 years later, Eddie didn't like the idea of how it might turn out. May 26, 4:15 p.m. I checked out the date and time by looking through an office window calendar and clocks side by side on one of the walls. Bingo. Okay, time for a little self-humiliation. I'm going to write about my first bath since I ran away. I mean, it's not like I haven't been washing. I give myself a good scrub in one of the bathrooms pretty well every day. You never know when a babe fest might break out around here. And I want to be ready. The weather's been the pits again. In fact, it's been so bad for so many days that I haven't even spent much time wandering around. I've mostly been hanging out inside buildings, but the sun finally came out a couple of days ago, started drying the mud that was everywhere, and today it was the warmest yet. I decided to celebrate the arrival of a real summer type day by having a bath. That doesn't happen to be as easy as it sounds. I woke up early, and after my morning duck swam off, I stripped naked inside the condo, which took a lot of wiggling around in a fairly long time. And then I just rolled out into the water. It was like ice. Worse than ice. I was even colder than some of those nights I spent in the storage shed. I didn't do much splashing. I was too cold. I couldn't use soap in the creek. That would have been bad for the birds. So I rubbed water all over myself. Rubbed so hard it hurt. And I got out of there in a hurry. I'll tell you one thing. As I was standing there, naked and shivering and trying to dry myself off with a t-shirt, I forgot to bring towels. I was thinking it might be a long time before I had another creek bath. Babe fest or no babe fest, I also worked out a way to wash my hair. A few days ago, I found a plastic pail left behind by a workman or someone on the zoo staff. I left it out in the rain for a few days. Don't they always tell you that rainwater is good for the scalp? Anyway, after I stopped shivering from the bath, I got the pail of water and plastic bottle of shampoo, finally something I actually remembered to bring from home. Then I walked off a little way from the creek and gave myself a very natural hair wash. Natural, but not convenient or fun. I don't think I ever fully appreciated just how useful a bathtub is. And I have to admit, this is the cleanest I've felt in a long time. I was feeling pretty good, too, so I decided to take a long walk around the zoo. It was good to see the animals out of their houses for a change. They probably felt the same way I did. I got out my notebook and spent a long time watching the polar bears. I like polar bears. In fact, I think it would be cool being one. Not only do you get to live in the north, where there aren't a lot of people to bug you, but when you're that big and tough, you aren't going to get hassled much, even if somebody does come around. Eddie had eaten lunch while watching the polar bears, mostly scrounged stuff people had left uneaten and ripped off bag chips. Then he resumed his stroll. As he was passing the children's playground that occupied an area not far from the main concession stand, he saw Jack Sim sitting on the ground. With all the crappy weather, he hadn't seen Jack for a while, and he decided this was as good a time as any to thank him for the sleeping bag and the tip on the place to sleep. Jack was sitting with his knees up and his arms crossed over them. Eddie sat down next to him. Jack wasn't wearing a coat, just a sweatshirt with University of Saskatchewan written across the front and what looked like the same pants he'd been wearing the other times Eddie saw him. Eddie looked at Jack Sim. There was something strange about the way the man was watching the kids in the playground. He was staring at them, concentrating, like he was studying them or something. Eddie didn't like it. Here was a guy who sat and looked at little kids playing on swings and slides, and who knew where Eddie slept. That wasn't good at all. Eddie didn't say anything to Jack, not even about the sleeping bag. He just sat and watched the man watching the kids. Jack never looked at him or said a word. It was like he didn't even know Eddie was there. They sat like that for a long time. It got later, and finally, the last mother and child left the playground and headed for the parking lot. "How's your day been?" Jack spoke suddenly without turning to look at him. "Okay, I guess. How about yours?" Jack nodded for an answer. Eddie thought he might say something about hanging out at the playground, but he didn't. "Feel like a cup of coffee?" Jack got up and brushed grass off his pants. Eddie stood up too. "I'll buy." They walked to the concession stand and Eddie bought 2 cups of coffee. Jack didn't argue about it. Eddie liked that. A lot of adults figured they were supposed to pay for everything when they were with kids. Eddie had always thought that was a crap. A way to remind kids that they weren't important enough to adult stuff like pay for things. They sat on a bench by the conservatory and drank the coffee. When he'd finished, Jack got up, nodded, and walked off. Eddie watched him go. The man sure wasn't a big talker. Eddie sat a while longer thinking about Jack Sim. He didn't know why a grown man would sit at a playground and watch kids the way Jack had been doing. It was strange, there was no doubt about that, but he still didn't want to believe it was because Jack got his jollies from kids. Trouble was, he'd been wrong about people before. When Steve first moved in with his mom, Eddie figured he was sort of cool. The 3 of them had done some stuff together, movies and stuff, and things were okay until the time Steve had gone after Eddie's mother. Eddie had been big time wrong about Steve. He hoped he wasn't wrong now.